Should I start now? Okay. Okay. Hi. So I think we can start. We're live. My name is Bernard Hoekman. I'm a professor at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute, where one of the things I do is act as a project coordinator for a Horizon 2020 framework project, which looks at realizing European soft power.
I cannot hear now. I can see them.
For external cooperation and trade. The focus of the project is very much on trade policy.
Hello, can you hear me now?
I will just do a brief introduction, Mr. Hogan, and then I'll turn the floor over to you. So just to continue, here at the European University Institute, I'm the coordinator for a project called RESPECT, which stands for Realizing European Soft Power in External Cooperation and Trade, which brings together a consortium of 10 research institutes in and outside Europe who are looking at the coherence of European external policies, including a specific focus on trade policy, and also looking at the effectiveness of these various policies in realizing European objectives. A lot of those objectives, of course, have to do with trade. Another core part of the objectives have to do with realizing European values. So we're very pleased today to welcome Mr. Phil Hogan, who is the Commissioner for Trade for the European Union. Mr. Hogan needs no introduction, of course, to a European audience. He was the Commissioner for Agriculture and Rural Development in the Juncker Commission and has a long career as a politician in Parliament and in government for Ireland. So Mr. Hogan is going to launch a review of the European trade policy. The way we'll work is Mr. Hogan will present the concepts and the focus of the efforts. Then we'll have a very brief question and answer session. Unfortunately, Mr. Hogan has unexpectedly had to cut the presentation short because he has to go to another meeting. But we will have some questions at the end of his intervention. And I would very much encourage everybody who is on the YouTube feed to write down their questions. We'll try and manage some of them, but we'll keep a record, and that will be sent to the Commission. And I think we will follow up with this, of course, because this is a consultation, and therefore the more questions we get, the better, although we won't be able to manage all of the questions in the half an hour that we have available.
Okay.
So, Mr. Hogan, over to you.
And thank you very much, Bernard, for your kind introduction. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're all doing well, and I trust that you are managing as best you can in these challenging times. I want to start by thanking President De Hoes and the European University Institute of Florence, and of course the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies, which of course is capably directed by my Irish compatriot, Professor Bridget Laffin, for facilitating this event. I was in Florence during my previous mandate as Agricultural Commissioner, and I can assure you that I would much rather be giving this speech in person in your beautiful city, but this is the way things are. The coronavirus has prevented this from happening, but I will say this, even virtually, I can think of no better forum than your renowned institution in which to launch a European policy review. The contribution that you are making to European scholarship is crucially important, particularly in the times we live in. And today, more than ever, our democratic discourse needs reliable and informed analysis and research. And this is one way to keep our European Union strong. Of course, a strong European Union also needs a strong trade and investment policy to help defend our interests and secure our place as the biggest trader in the world. For a long time, there was something close to a global consensus about market forces and trade. Now the world is changing, and we must change too. Trade and investment policy is a core European competence. In other words, it's an area where member states pool their sovereignty willingly, and they recognize that their collective power is far greater than the sum of its parts. Our immense strength as a trading power is evidenced by the number of agreements that we have signed in recent years, principally the comprehensive deals we signed with Canada and Japan. And just last week, the Vietnamese Parliament ratified the agreement with the European Union, meaning it's now on track to come into force later this year. This is the largest deal we've ever signed with a developing country and an important building block towards further cooperation in the strategically important ASEAN region. Our network of bilateral deals now in the European Union numbers 76, and I like to call this the opportunity of openness, because these agreements bring many benefits to the European Union. Firstly, they provide huge opportunities for our exporters. They give consumers a wider choice. They help us to promote European, that gives us the significant leverage and economic clout to be arguably the world's most influential trading partner. 32 years ago, a very prescient European head of state predicted that the single market will be a major factor, possibly the major factor, in our competitive position in European and world markets into the 21st century. Well, how right Margaret Thatcher was. She understood that in trade, size matters, and a fact that seems to have escaped some of her successors. The economic data is resoundingly positive in relation to the benefits of our open trade agenda. Today, 1 in 7 European Union jobs is supported either directly or indirectly from exports. This is a full 2/3 more than what it was in the year 2000. But trade policy is not static. It is constantly evolving, and it's highly dynamic, and it must be refreshed and revised to stay relevant. We need to re-establish a consensus around the why and the what of trade policy. That is why today I am proud to officially launch a review process of our shared European trade and investment policy. And you could ask the question, why now? Our last significant EU trade communication in policy terms was a document entitled Trade for All in 2015. So much has changed since then, and many of these changes present us with huge challenges. Our trade and our trade rules are increasingly exposed to the volatility of international relations. China continues to expand its global influence, including within the European Union, and it's an important partner for cooperation, but equally a systemic rival. The global footprint of the United States has changed radically, with a retreat from its traditional role of global leadership in trade. And the digitalization of our societies and economies continues to accelerate at a staggering pace. And the European commitment to be a global leader on climate and sustainable development has grown exponentially, in line with the expectations of our people. We also need to acknowledge that we must be more assertive in enforcing our rights and defending ourselves against unfair competition. These unfair practices have increased in recent years, and we need to shore up our protections and our toolbox in relation to trade defense in order to prevent competitors taking advantage of the fact that we have the most open economic system in the world. The World Trade Organization, of course, is in crisis, and it is operating according to a rule book that was written in 1995, and it requires urgent root and branch reform to become relevant again. Global trade requires global rules, and without a functioning WTO, we will all end up worse off. All of these changes need to be fully reflected in our European Union trade policy, because of course trade policy is about much more than trade. It is a core European policy that has a significant wider impact across the spectrum of policy making. For example, it has an important contribution to make to the European Green Deal, which is our flagship climate and sustainability agenda, and also to our farm to fork strategy, which helps to build sustainable food systems. And of course, we have the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course is another very powerful factor to review our trade policy. This recent pandemic and ongoing pandemic, of course, has highlighted vulnerabilities in our supply chains that we must address in order to be better prepared for future crises. The pandemic has devastated our economies. The European Union economy is expected to contract by 7.4% in 2020, while global GDP will fall by 3.5%. And the coronavirus political environment has seen the escalation of some trends that were already on the rise before the pandemic, including calls for protectionism, for economic nationalism, and the rejection of global institutions. There have been prominent voices calling for the WTO to be dismantled and proclaiming the death of globalization. So in this regard, perhaps some commentators view the European Commission and our position a bit out of touch. So to them, I would simply say, we need to get real. The globalized nature of our society and our economy is a fact. It's here to stay, and pretending otherwise slows down our capacity to make the right changes. Does climate action require global cooperation? Of course it does. Does our economic recovery from COVID-19 require well-functioning global supply chains? Of course it does. Does the digital economy need globally agreed fit-for-purpose rules? Of course it does. And maintaining our belief in the opportunity of openness does not mean that we are woolly-headed idealists. We recognize that some things need to change in the aftermath of COVID-19. And we recognize that trade policy can and should be more effective in relation to pursuing European interests in today's world. So today we are asking for the views of our people and our stakeholders to help us develop a bespoke EU trade policy approach for the post-coronavirus global economy. We are calling this approach Open Strategic Autonomy. Now, I know that this may seem like a very sexy title, but I can assure you that those three words encompass many important priorities. Open strategic autonomy means reaffirming our global leadership and our global ambitions across a range of areas, in line with the aims of a more geopolitical European Commission. It also means building stronger alliances with like-minded partners, not less. It means shaping a better type of globalization, which is fairer and more sustainable. It reflects our commitment to strong and up-to-date multilateral rules. It recalls our belief in the opportunity of openness, and while at the same time it advocates for a tougher and more assertive approach to protect our businesses and our consumers, notably through stronger trade defence and enforcement. And it calls for the diversification of supply chains to assure our strategic independence. So the concept of open strategic autonomy was enshrined as a policy priority in the Commission's 2020 recovery communication, which was published in May, and which was titled Europe's Moment, Repair and Prepare for the Next Generation. Our revised proposal for the European Union budget, combined with our 750 billion euros recovery instrument, means that we have a total amount of 1.85 billion in financial firepower to drive a recovery through our European Union budget for the next 7 years. This means we now have an opportunity, backed by huge resources, more resources than ever, to emerge quickly from this crisis and build a smart and sustainable new normal. Of course, this will require courageous political leadership and requires the unanimous agreement of our member states. We've already taken some steps in the right direction in recent times, and we are strengthening our implementation and enforcement agenda also in trade. We're doing this both inside the European Union and across our worldwide relationships. A lot of companies and a lot of small businesses in particular think we can do more, and they're right, in terms of getting better outcomes from our existing free trade agreements. So we're setting up a specific office in the Commission called a Chief Trade Enforcement Office to be able to deal with these issues about how we can get more benefits, particularly for our SMEs. It'll help our exporters to gain more value from our partner markets that we have today, and will also strengthen the enforcement of sustainable development commitments, notably on climate action and labour rights. This Chief Trade Enforcement Office will be crucially important, as I say, in ensuring that our SMEs get better value from the existing trade deals. It'll also ensure that any problem is identified early on and that swift and appropriate action can be taken at an earlier stage to ensure that we have compliance with our existing agreements. I believe also that this Chief Trade Enforcement Office will make us stronger on the home front by helping to assess where we're most vulnerable and determining how to effectively deploy our trade defence instruments to protect our companies and our consumers. This is a Europe that protects in action without being protectionist. So we're vigorously pursuing WTO reform at the same time, because we believe that with the right leadership and the right reforms, this organisation can be the beating heart of global economic recovery. Our bounce back ability agenda depends on keeping trade open, free and fair, with predictable and enforceable rules. The Commission President von der Leyen, has said on many occasions that multilateralism is in our DNA in the European Union. And of course, she is correct. The Union is the ultimate proof that multilateralism, handled correctly, actually works. So we're making huge efforts to refresh the transatlantic relationship which remains the central artery of the world's economy and our most important strategic alliance. We are doing business of about $3 billion a day, transatlantic. But we are at the same time putting a more stronger focus as well on our closest partners in our neighbouring region and Africa. Besides their obvious geographic and geopolitical importance, these countries offer important growth in production markets, as well as representing a key source of imports for goods and services, and a key source of raw materials for many of our European businesses. It's therefore mutually beneficial for both the European Union and our partners to strengthen our trade and investment relationships. You will recall, as Agricultural Commissioner, I established a task force on rural Africa, where we came together, Europe and Africa, to show how much can be achieved through genuine partnership and cooperation between peoples and businesses on both continents. So we can do a similar type model in the future in respect of many other sectors. So we have already taken some steps on the journey to a revitalized trade policy. Now we want to hear from our stakeholders and citizens to help us to take the next steps. We've just published a very detailed consultation note with a set of guiding questions. The public consultation is open until September the 15th, 2020. Our translation services are working hard to have the consultation documents available in all EU official languages in July. Between now and September 15th, we will also organise a number of meetings with stakeholders, which will be another opportunity to gather feedback. This follows through on our commitment to being transparent in shaping our trade agenda. The European Union is already the world's most transparent public authority when it comes to trade policy, but we want to do even more. We want our stakeholders and our people to make their voices heard and feel ownership of a policy that has a direct impact on their lives. And we want to build a new and inclusive consensus around what, why and how of trade policy at home and abroad. Once we have gathered and collated all of the input, this will feed into a Commission communication, which will be published at the end of this year. So let me conclude, ladies and gentlemen, by once again thanking the EUI Florence for providing this platform today. I encourage all of you to have your say in the public consultation that I've just outlined. The Union is hugely important in terms of global trade. We are unique in that we are not a nation state big power. We are a big power made up of nation states working together. And by our nature, we understand that modern economies and societies are interconnected. By our nature, we recognize that modern supply chains work across national boundaries and will continue to do so. And also by our nature, we demonstrate to the world that with a strong common rule book, countries can have the confidence to maintain openness, where that openness brings real, tangible benefits to the lives of our people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I'm sure you will get a lot of suggestions from all over Europe and also outside of Europe, of course, in terms of the various questions that are asked in the consultation document. I've had a chance to look at the document, so I have a little bit of an advance on everyone else. So just a couple of questions, given that we are short in time. One of them relates to the COVID-19 pandemic and the policy responses that we've seen to the pandemic. And what the document notes is that we need to be thinking more about how trade policy can actually help improve the resilience of supply chains, help encourage diversification. So maybe a few thoughts in terms of, given the current set of instruments that are available to the Commission, especially on the trade policy front, what kind of concretely are you thinking in terms of kind of what the link is between these trade policy instruments and achieving the objective of greater resilience while maintaining the openness of the European economy?
Well, thank you, Bernard. Well, I suppose we've learned a lot of lessons from the recent pandemic about where we were vulnerable in a number of sectors as well. And we saw that at first hand in relation to health and medical supplies. China, we were very largely dependent on China for the supply of essential PPE, for example, and ventilators. We saw in India where we were very dependent on them for pharmaceutical products. And at the beginning of the pandemic in early March, 10% of all of the production of our masks were produced in the European Union. Only 10%. So there was a big effort made by my colleague Commissioner Breton and to try and mobilize production systems, in various industries that were going to be closing on a temporary basis. And industry has responded magnificently in the European Union for this acute demand. And it's an ongoing acute demand to allow people to be able to return to work. So now we have about 60% of the production of masks are produced in the European Union. And indeed in our neighbourhood countries, we have significant amount of production lines as well open for other essential products. So whilst it showed you that we were vulnerable and dependent, at the same time it showed how much we were, there are other examples of where global supply chains showed how interdependent we are. For example, to manufacture a ventilator, it requires about 900 components, much of which are produced in the European Union, but assembled or continued with the manufacturing of them in China. So the notion that we can be self-sufficient in everything in the European Union is certainly something that I think is pie in the sky. We have to continue to do what we are doing, but doing better. We have to realize that we need to stockpile like we did in the oil crisis of the 1970s, where we had 90-day reserves was the outcome of negotiations with various countries that were producing oil for countries that were not able to produce oil. So we are looking at this kind of a model of reserves, of production, but also stockpiling, whatever is necessary and wherever it comes from, internally or externally from the European Union, in order to meet our policy objective in this way. So, there's a mixture of a number of pieces to the jigsaw here in terms of providing resilience. But we are very low in raw materials in the European Union. People may not maybe realize that. We depend on imports of raw materials for European businesses to be able to produce goods and services, and particularly goods. So the notion that we are going to, become a little bit more protectionist is not going to happen, because people are going to vote with their feet. They're going to do what they have to do in order to get the imports to produce the goods and services to be able to export around the world. And indeed, of course, notwithstanding the fact that we have to satisfy our own domestic market as well. And the other final point I would make is that we can often be taken for granted in our internal market for the fact that we have a very open market to third countries. And we see in particular that can be open to certain abuse, where state-owned enterprises can subsidize companies in order to compete with European companies in an unfair way. And our EU-China communication of March 2019 spelled out this rather well, where we now see, the need to have a level playing field. So we're discussing this with China at the moment, as part of our investment negotiations, which we hope to conclude by the end of the year. But the key issues of industrial subsidies, the key issues of state-owned enterprises and how they operate, and forced technology transfer, these are very important issues that are on the table now as we speak. And if we don't get a level playing field, we have to have tools in our toolbox that's able to demand reciprocity in terms of market openings. There's no point in having Europe being naive and be totally open to these third countries, and at the same time we're not getting reciprocity for our European companies. So these are all part of the jigsaw that we're trying to build in a long-winded way to answer your question.
Okay. So just to follow up on that, I mean, clearly there is a lot happening in terms of trade policy around the world, right? So if we look at something like the Global Trade Alert Initiative, which monitors policy actions being taken by governments everywhere, you see already there was a big spike in more trade policy activism before the COVID crisis. So this has been something that's been happening. And so one of the things that struck me about the document in terms of the trade policy review is, in order to establish whether or not there is a level playing field, we need information on what those policies actually are, which I think there's a lot of that out there. What we're missing is the analysis of those types of policies in terms of what the effects are, right? In terms of actually identifying what is really most important, what really distorts competition on a market, what really has negative implications potentially for European consumers. So another question I had is, in terms of thinking about the review, is there also thinking about how do we actually prioritize on the basis of kind of evidence as to what really has the most detrimental effects, as opposed to, we might see a lot of policies that a business might complain about or that we have concerns about, but how do we know what actually is the most important in terms of negative effects, and balancing that against the potential positive effects of some of these subsidy type policies, insofar as, for example, they deal with the climate change challenge, right? So I think this is something, of course, that we do inside the European Union, but I was wondering to what extent there's thinking as part of the review as to how do we actually do that balancing exercise with our trading partners.
I didn't pick up everything you said there, Bernard, unfortunately, but I'm going to try my best at lip reading some of what you asked me to address. You're quite right that I'm going to maybe, certainly you mentioned the need for better data and the need for better analysis of the data in order to inform us better in terms of trade policy and in the context of this review. And you're very much correct on this. It's a constant challenge to get up-to-date data, particularly from our member states. Sometimes they don't like to share data, but we need to have the pooling of data in order to make informed decisions on behalf of our 27 member states. And we will be working with all of the various institutions and think tanks in every member state to try and see can we get an understanding about getting timely data and getting good data. Over the last while, and indeed in the run-up to the pandemic, there was a lot of restrictions imposed, in export restrictions, and this, of course, was accentuated by the pandemic itself. So we are working with the G20, and we're working with the WTO to make sure that the spirit of temporary and proportionate restrictions that were being imposed to deal with a short-term crisis, that these restrictions are removed as quickly as possible. So we're using all of the international fora. We brought in an export authorization scheme ourselves in the beginning in order to overcome a very difficult situation within the European Union in terms of border restrictions for various products, which was, of course, not in keeping with the spirit of the law of the European single market. So we now have dropped this export authorization since the 26th of May and moved back to a more open policy in the same way as we had before the pandemic. So this is just one example of where these measures that were taken should be temporary, should be proportionate, and should be transparent. And the WTO can play a very important role here, as you know. But equally, in the context of trade policy, it's not just about market access. It's about much more than that. And it's about sustainable development. And one of the areas I feel that we can make a lot of common cause is how we can actually integrate the sustainable development goals into trade policy through the WTO. And this is one of the areas where I would like to see progress made, where we have signed up to international agreements as member states and as various players in the world, whether it is climate or sustainable development. But we are sometimes very slow in terms of implementation and monitoring what's happening. And if the European Union is going to take leadership on through the European Green Deal and through mechanisms like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, we certainly want to see our neighbours and all countries able to make and continue to participate in a more global sense. Otherwise, it'll provide another uneven playing field. So, these are the type of areas that hopefully our trade policy review will give an opportunity to our stakeholders and the citizens to be able to see where we can work better together and implementing the necessary programs and measures to make these a reality. And of course, we depend largely on the support of our member states to give us the data, to give us the best possible information to inform us of that.
Okay, thank you very much.
I don't know whether this answers.
I know we are.
I don't know whether it answers the
are.
question you asked, but my best.
Okay, I hope you can understand. You can hear me, but I know we're running out of time. So I'd like to thank you for your time. I would really like to encourage everyone, of course, to engage in the consultation. I'd just like to leave you with one thought that is coming out of our research, on the effectiveness of European trade policy to achieve especially non-trade objectives. And there's a pretty clear sense among the experts and the analytical evidence is that trade agreements are not necessarily kind of the best or the most effective instrument to achieve many of the objectives we have. And that, of course, is recognized by the European member states and the Commission because we have multiple instruments. So I think one of the big kind of lessons that comes out of the research is, as the Americans would say, horses for courses. So there are certain instruments which are much more effective at achieving particular objectives. And I very much hope that the consultation will actually help identify kind of changes in potentially designing the trade agreements themselves and the choice of instruments we use to actually achieve particular objectives. So let me thank you again for launching the review through the European University Institute and the RESPECT projects. And I look very much forward to what comes out of the consultations. And I think I can safely say on behalf of myself and all of the consortium members in this project, given that this is what we're focusing on, you will very much get quite a few suggestions from us, as well as from everybody else who is both on this call and in Europe. So thank you again.
Thank you.